Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 3 for English 271, Introduction to Poetry. Today we're going to talk about a number of things, but our main subject is the Romantic period of poetry. That's romantic with a capital R, not a lowercase r. We'll talk about that important difference later in the lecture. As a quick recap before we get started, our first lesson was just a general introduction to poetry, where we went over some important poetry terminology, such as the dramatic situation with speaker, listener, and context, and then the three types of poetry with epic/narrative, dramatic, and lyric. And then we only looked at a few songs and one poem as just a general introduction. And terminology is important throughout all our lessons. Then in lesson 2, we started with our study of poetry chronologically, and a lot of the developments with poetry have happened in the last 200 years. So today we're going to look at our first poems from the 19th century or the 1800s and then move forward in time for lessons 3, 4, 5, and 6. But prior to the 19th century, there were three major poetic movements. There were others. Poetry is actually one of the oldest genres. It's been around the longest because like I said last time, people could speak it out loud more easily. So plays are also pretty old, drama, but not quite as old. And then fiction is the most recent. And fiction didn't really rise to prominence till midway through the 19th century when the masses um, became literate because of educational reforms in the U.S. and England. So even though we're really going to be looking at poetry from the 1800s onward for 2/3 of our class, poetry is the oldest and longest genre. It's just with, like I said, the spread of the printing press starting in the 1400s and then education. In the 1800s, there's just been more, you could say, developments with different kind of literary movements and reforms and stuff to the genre the last 250 years. So the three movements we looked at last time were the ancient epics, such as the ones from Greece and Rome, and Italy, and even northern England to or northern Europe to England with Beowulf. But we used as our case study the Odyssey, which is from ancient Greece. And epic poetry you don't see as much today, and it's the main example of narrative poetry. But the Raven, which we're going to study today, is also sort of an example of narrative poetry. We'll talk about that. And then the development of the sonnet, which is the most popular of the fixed poetry forms, and its rise to prominence in the 1400s and 1600s, with the most famous sonneteer Shakespeare as our case study. And then thirdly, lastly, we looked at the metaphysical poets and the development of the conceit in the 17th century with John Donne, again, the most famous metaphysical poet, as our example. So that brings us right up to the 1800s and the rise of Romanticism. The Romantic period was very famous for its poetry. So we're going to look at the Romantics today. Next time we'll do the Victorians and then the Moderns and then all the way up to the present in our final lecture. This is also going to be a longer lecture. I know I've said that several times. There's just so much clearing of the ground. And the reason this one is a little bit longer is part one, we're going to talk about writing about poetry because your first paper is due in Module 4. So there's no lesson in Module 4. Your sole focus of Module 4 is writing the paper. So I never just ask students to write a paper without providing a lecture on poetry. So that's going to be the first half. And then the second half will be what you probably should finally hope to expect with a normal lecture length, and that's what lessons 4 through 6 should be like. But we'll divide that into two parts, and these will be the two parts or sets of poems you address on the discussion board. So our long work this time is Poe's The Raven, which is definitely probably the most famous poem from the Romantic period, if not all of the 19th century. And it's a quintessential example of Romanticism, but it's a longer poem, 100 lines. So that's our part 2 of the total lesson, but part 1 for the discussion board. Sort of like last time where we had a set of questions on the Odyssey because it was our longer work, and then a set of shorter lyric poems for the second half. This time for the second half, our shorter lyric poems are by Emily Dickinson, William Blake, and John Keats. So with Poe and Dickinson, you get 2 romantics from the U.S., and with Blake and Keats, 2 from England, and we have some good representation of canonical romanticism there to introduce you to that period. I'll also do some background on romanticism, and this is our third and final lecture where I'll go over specific poetic terminology. How I went over those terms I reviewed earlier in lesson 1, and then last time how we talked about meter and scansion. We're going to talk about sound and rhyme because Poe is such an excellent example of sound, and that'll round out our discussion of terminology. So these first 3 lessons, I know it moves fast in the accelerated summer session, but these first 3 lessons are actually where we get all the clearing of the ground of the terminology. And then, as you'll see when I grade your discussion boards, I'm hoping to see you use some of that terminology. Again, the terminology is what sets poetry apart from fiction and drama and why it has its own specialized introductory class. So I'm hoping to see you use that both in the discussion boards and your papers. And I'll give you feedback on your discussion boards to help lead you up to the paper. But of course, I want to talk about the best strategies for writing about poetry. So this will look like us starting with my tips for writing that I've learned over the years as I've had to do much writing in my field, and then going over the rubric for the first paper, and then breaking down an example paper to see some examples of the things I ask you to do from the rubric. Okay, here are my tips for writing. So the first one is to start your paper well in advance of the due date. I cannot stress this enough. You need time to write and revise, which is point number 2 there. So you need to start it before the due date or you won't have time. There's actually only a 3-day turnaround between lesson 3 and the paper because of how this accelerated summer schedule works. So I'd actually recommend, and I'll announce this in Canvas, and I've said it in earlier lectures, because if you're watching this lecture, you're on lesson 3. But I would recommend actually starting the paper before lesson 3. If there's a poet from this lesson you really want to write on, either do this lesson earlier or at least read that poet and start your paper sooner. The other thing I wanted to say before we go beyond point number 1 here is that these tips are not meant to be like a heavy-handed explanation from me of you must do this to be a successful writer. I have had to do a lot of writing over the years to get into the field of education that I'm in, and it was challenging at times. When I was earning my doctorate, there were times I almost failed out solely because my writing was so poor. But I eventually graduated and received high praise from my evaluators when I graduated. So these are the things I learned that helped me turn it around and not fail out of grad school. So, but what I was doing wrong, even though I was in grad school, was the basics, the most fundamental things. That's why they're applicable at every level. So I'm just trying to pass on the things that I've learned, hoping they can be helpful to you and others. And so the first one is to start your paper well ahead of the due date. When I was an undergrad, I did almost every assignment the night before it was due or the night it was due, and that was usually some of my worst writing. But another reason to do it is that way you have time to revise. So point 2 is to write multiple drafts. And then as you go from draft 1 to draft 2, don't start rereading and revising your paper immediately afterwards. Let it cool off. Again, the more time you give yourself, the more days you can take off in between, and that's the more days off in between, the better. Have you ever gone back and read something you wrote weeks or months or even years before? Like, I would suggest pausing this lesson or later on going and finding a paper you wrote for a class last quarter, last year, in high school, earlier, and just seeing what you think of it. And it won't have to do with just your age. It'll have to do with the objectivity that comes from time and distance. So I would say at a minimum, give yourself one whole day in between. I mean, if you're tight time-wise for the summer schedule and you do lesson 3 on Thursday, write your paper on Friday, give yourself a whole day off on Saturday, and then finish it on Sunday to meet the deadline. Because you've got to let it cool off. Writing is something we do in private, but it is read and evaluated by an audience. So we will never be able to be as objective as our audience, which is why point number 7 down there in a minute is so helpful. But if we at least give ourselves some time off in between, that'll enhance our objectivity. The next one, point number 5 there, make the conclusion from your first draft the introduction to your second draft. This sounds counterintuitive, but it actually makes so much sense. Writing is this unique process where we almost struggle through, or we do struggle through that first draft. And so we often actually, no matter how good our planning is, no matter how great our first thesis is, even if it's really good, we usually discover what we truly want to say through the act and the process of struggling through writing that first draft. But we often don't go back and revise to fit our awesome conclusion we come to at the end of our first draft. I literally had my dissertation director say that to me in grad school. And so often I read student papers, they're not making sense. I get to the conclusion, I'm like, oh, it all makes sense now. But it's not a mystery novel where you don't want to reveal the twist till the end. You want to guide your reader through your paper because you're making an academic argument. So you may even literally copy and paste the conclusion from your first draft to the top of the paper when you revise to create your second draft. Or you can just go back and revise your intro so it matches your conclusion, and then revise the paper, the topic, sentences, etc. accordingly so it all syncs up. You want it to be nice and tight and flow well, so you want the ideas you figure out through writing your first draft to be prominent at the beginning, the end, all the way through. When it comes to writing intros, bodies, and conclusions, I say tell the reader what you're going to do it, and then tell them what you did. And you want what you tell them you're going to do, and when you tell them what you did, you want that to match up nice and tightly. Once you've got that done and you've got like a second or maybe even later really solid draft, then have other people read it. You could reach out to someone in the class even through the Canvas Messenger and ask people in class to read it. But if you have a roommate, friend, coworker, family member, significant other, whatever, have someone read it. Or I would suggest multiple people give you feedback. It's again, we can't be objective about our own writing because it's a personal process, but we're writing it for an audience. That sounds ironic, and it is. So we need to have other people read it. That was the biggest piece of advice my dissertation director gave me in grad school, and it was the thing that turned my writing around the most, although all of these things helped. I had fellow grad students read it. Boy, did they give me some good feedback. It was hard to hear at first, but it really made my writing better. You can visit the Writer's Center. There's instructions on how to do that on the actual assignment page is for both our papers, and I'll give you extra credit, 1 point. So if you get a 29 out of 30, but you went to the Writer's Center, you'll get full credit. And then I'll receive a message from the Writer's Center telling me you had an appointment and the date and time. So I'll know to give you that extra credit. If for some reason I don't give you the extra credit, I didn't get the message from the Writer's Center, then email me and tell me. Excuse me. Lastly, audience is everything. When I finally turned my writing around in grad school, my director said, he praised it, said it was much better. He said, what you're doing differently now is you're writing for readers, not just for yourself. So having others read your paper will help you do this, but also think about your audience as you write. You'll have these ideas swirling around in your head probably for days. Your audience won't have been thinking about the same thing. I just wrote something I thought was really good and it went over really well. It was an important thing I had to write. But I did have people review it first and they said, your ideas aren't here. Your connections aren't clear here between this example you use at the beginning and then your different subpoints. They don't connect back to your thesis. And so I really reworked the first half or so of what I wrote, and then it went over very well when I actually presented it to my audience. So it's so easy to forget because we're in our own head. That's the nature of writing, but we're in our own head, but we're writing for someone else. So really reread and make sure your connections, your ideas are clear and have other people point out to you where they're not. And this all boils down to the final point there. Write multiple drafts, revise them, turn them in. When I say before you turn in the final one, I mean to Canvas. When I say multiple drafts, I don't mean you need to start a new document. I mean you can, but what I mainly mean is you go back into the same document with some time off, you reread it, you edit it, doing these things. Hopefully these tips are helpful. They're definitely things you could take with you to another class. All right. Here is our rubric. So make an argument about the text that is supported by thorough analysis of actual language from the text. This is like a summative point, and then the rest of these are things you can go through and you can check off as you go to make sure you have these. So this is a summative statement because it includes the three things you need to have. I've been saying this all along. You need to have an argument, an interpretation. This is what you think the meaning or the message of the text is. You need to quote from the text, and then you need to prove that the quote from the text supports your argument by explaining for the readers how it does that. So if you have those three things, an argument, textual evidence, and analysis of the textual evidence to show how it proves your argument, you'll be solid. The way this should look is an introduction that sets up and contextualizes your text and argument, so you don't have the argument, the thesis, be your opening sentence. You get to that, I would recommend the final sentence of your introductory paragraph be your thesis, and then you give just some general background, enough context earlier in the intro to set it up for readers when they get to that thesis in the last sentence of the intro. And then it's the thing they remember as they read the body of the paper. And the intro should be the second shortest paragraph in your paper. The conclusion should be your shortest. Offer a unique or creative thesis. Obviously, the thesis has to be an argument with a reason why. You're not required to do any research in this class. It's only a 200 level class. For a literature class like this, if you were 300 or 400 level, I would ask you to do research. Here, it's introduction to poetry, so I just want to see your ability to engage with the poetic text, to make claims about it, and support those claims. So usually research is how we show that our thesis is unique or creative, is why I mention it here. To satisfy this requirement in the class, you just need to have a clear interpretation of the text. This is what you think it means, and you want to use specific language. It shouldn't be generic sounding. Provide clear claims at the start of each body paragraph. These are often called topic sentences, and they contain many thesis statements or many arguments. So if you think of you have an overarching thesis at the end of your intro for the whole paper, each body paragraph after your intro and before your conclusion should have its own thesis that you prove in the course of that paragraph by analyzing the text or quoting the text and analyzing it. And if you prove those smaller claims in each of your body paragraphs and you have good connections throughout, you'll subsequently prove your thesis. They're like supporting arguments that, when you prove them, subsequently prove your main argument. And that, again, should be the opening sentence of each paragraph, so that the reader can, as the reader reads your paragraph, they know what argument you're proving there. If you get to the main point of the paragraph in the final sentence, it's going to be that same, well, now it makes sense, but I wish I knew those last 7 or 8 sentences I was reading. Point 5 there, your argument should have a logical flow to it. And like I said, your intro could look like general context to set up the thesis. Intro ends with a thesis statement. Then each paragraph after that, mini thesis, quote from the text, explanation of how the quote from the text proves that mini thesis with connections back to your overall thesis in the first and last sentences of each body paragraph. The paper should just have a logical structure and organization, flow well. I think that comes right out of my last comment. Obviously, you need to have effective grammar, spelling, punctuation, etc. This is sort of like the lowest category. This isn't a quantitative rubric, it's qualitative. There's not a certain level of points I assign to these categories, but I basically don't take any points off for point number 7 there unless the paper is difficult to read. So write clearly and plainly. I found in my many years teaching that students often try to impress professors by using big words. Think about audience, going back to the writing tips. Write in the clearest, most straightforward, plainest way possible, and be as specific and precise in your word choice as possible. Don't use big words, use the words that fit the best, that are in general, that I know what you're talking about. And again, unless I have to like reread a lot of sentences multiple times to get your meaning, you won't lose any points for category 7 there. If you have any concerns about this, have me read an early draft. I should have said this earlier, but I'm happy to look at thesis statements and read drafts before your paper is due. Just email me. Connect all your claims back to your thesis. So if you have those 2, 3, or 4 supporting points in your body paragraphs, don't just have those, don't have each body paragraph feel like an island. Make connections to your thesis. How does this mini thesis relate to your overall thesis? Again, first and last sentences of the paragraph's best place to do that. Number 9 is something I put on all my rubrics, but it's probably more applicable in fiction and drama classes. If you're writing on epic poetry, like if you write on the Odyssey or even like the Raven today, always do a little bit of summary. Don't just assume, even though it's for a class like this, you want to write in a way like you're writing to a general audience, because that will make your writing the clearest and help you improve as a writer. Obviously, I know the plot of the Odyssey and the Raven, so you give a little bit of summary, enough to help, like in your paragraphs, if you have a topic sentence that states what the paragraph is about and then a quote. If you're writing on the Odyssey or the Raven or something with a narrative, some of our Victorian poems in lesson 4 will be kind of narrative driven. You want maybe like 1 or 2 sentences, a summary after your topic sentence before your quote, to kind of situate me with what exactly you're emphasizing in that particular paragraph. But you don't want much of the paper to be summary. You want the majority of it to be analysis. Again, probably most of your papers will be on short lyric poetry, so this is less of an issue in this class. I still include it though. You still want to situate me, the reader. You want to situate your reader in what's going on in each paragraph, but spend the majority of the time analyzing the quotes. And then obviously it needs to end with a conclusion. Conclusion should be straightforward. Don't overthink it. It's easy to overthink the conclusion. What I've seen that is not good with conclusions are conclusions that are really long. You don't need to recap every supporting point. Think of it as short and sweet. Think of it as tying up loose ends, as it's a present you're giving the professor, so wrap it up and put a nice bow on it. A few sentences is all you need to just make it feel cohesive. If you want to show why your topic is important and you haven't done that yet, I call that the so what factor. The conclusion is a great place to do that. Okay, moving quickly so that we can get to the poetry, but to give you examples of these things. I've got 3 papers on Canvas that are sample papers. They're not all on poetry because I want you to see like examples, things you can think, this is what a thesis looks like. This is what a topic sentence looks like. This is what close reading looks like. But not ones that you emulate. Don't think these are formulas where you plug in your ideas. No, these are just kind of some examples. And each paper has its strengths and its weaknesses. But I want you to see how to do thesis statements, how to do topic sentences, and how to do close reading. Close reading is the analysis of the quotation from the work before we move on. So that's why I've given you papers that aren't necessarily about poetry. I think one of them is. But these strategies apply to writing about any type of literature, really any type of content. So these examples are from the paper on the 1001 Nights. So her thesis was the 1001 Nights is the story. Oh, this is a negative example. Sorry. The 1001 Nights is the story of Scheherazade telling the king a different story every night to save the women in the kingdom. This isn't her actual thesis. I plucked this sentence from earlier in the intro to show you. I like to show by contrast when I do examples. So what? Pause it and write down what is wrong. What do you think is wrong with this thesis? It summarizes what happens in the text without taking a clear stance. It's summary, not analysis. Analysis is where you make an argument. So let's look at her actual thesis. The 1001 Nights subverts the patriarchal standards of the day by exposing a woman's potential to be just as powerful, intelligent, and heroic as a man through the protagonist Scheherazade. So again, pause and answer, why do you think this is a more effective thesis? We'll go over more reasons on the next slide, but the main reason is it makes an argument. That word subverts is a key word there. Subverts is like a synonym for critiquing or criticizing. So that's a stance the text, the 1001 Nights, does this thing, and it has a clear, like it's saying something is bad. So that's what makes it an argument. If you just said the 1001 Nights is about the patriarchal standards of the day, then it still wouldn't be a thesis. You don't have to use the word subverts, but you got to use some kind of word that makes an argument. Some people might disagree. A lot of people think the 1001 Nights is patriarchal. So this student has to defend this. That makes it a thesis. Continuing on, more about a thesis statement. The other thing I want to say is she also gives a reason why through the character Scheherazade. So take a stance and give a reason why. And you can also see there, I jumped to the next slide too soon, what the kind of an outline of supporting points, what she would talk about in each body paragraph. Some other things you want to avoid, I'll say this real quickly, your thesis, needs to be an opinion. It's what you think the text is about, but you're going to support it with evidence. So don't talk like it's an opinion even though it is one. So don't say I think, I believe, I feel, or in my opinion. You don't have to say I do something, but if you can't help yourself, say I argue that so it sounds more professional. Don't say I will or the paper will do this. Notice that student didn't say she would talk about those three things. She just said those three things are the three kind of things that you see Scheherazade do. So don't use the future tense key or the past tense. When you're talking about the literature, if you're summarizing the plot of the Odyssey, don't use the past tense. Use the present tense. Odysseus does this. Not he did this. And similarly, don't use the future tense. Don't say I will or this paper will discuss these three aspects. Just list them out some way where it's all in the present tense. And again, that thesis on the last slide, go back, look at the sample paper, does that excellently. Don't tell readers what you will do or are going to do. Just tell them your argument. So earlier I said tell them what you're going to do it, and then tell them what you did. When I say tell them what you're going to do, I mean tell them your argument. So state your argument, prove your argument, restate your argument might be a better way to do that. Avoid the future tense. All right, so topic sentences. Again, we'll look at so these are the mini thesis statements at the start of each paragraph. Again, we'll look at a negative example and then a positive example. And again, this student did such a good job. She didn't have any negative examples, so I just plucked summary to give you some negative examples. But the summary is in the right place in her paper. The frame story repeatedly shows Scheherazade telling the king a different story each night. What is wrong with this topic sentence? It summarizes the plot. So you may need this, like if the 1001 Nights is a very narrative text, so I think the student has a short summary of the overall text after the intro, and then in each paragraph, pertinent summary, but not too much, like I said. But it's easy to start, because if your body paragraph 1 is about Scheherazade telling the king a different story each night, it's really easy to start the paragraph with that. Don't start it with that. That comes later. I know it feels logical to start telling the story, especially if you're writing on a narrative text, but the story is just support. The story is really just to give context for the quotation. So start with the idea, what is the argument of the paragraph, and then tell me the 1 or 2 plot points that are pertinent to understanding your argument. But tell me the argument first so I know what you're arguing in the paragraph. This sentence may tell me the paragraph's about this part of the 1001 Nights, but it doesn't tell me the argument you're making, and that's what the reader cares about. So here's a stronger example. Here's her actual topic sentence. The frame story repeatedly shows Scheherazade exerting power over the king through her enchanting stories. So this student, if I'm remembering correctly, I actually flipped the order of the sentences here to illustrate my point to you. Like, even though example 1, the negative example, is telling the story, example 2's got to come first. Because why do I care that she tells the king a different story each night? I understand after I read the topic sentence that why it matters that she tells the king a different story each night. But then if it reads here, I'll read them in order for you. The frame story repeatedly shows Scheherazade exerting power over the king through her enchanting stories. It repeatedly shows Scheherazade telling the king a different story each night. Okay, I know why I'm reading this paragraph, and then I know the specific part of the text the paragraph is zooming in on. Now I'm ready to have a quote in the 3rd sentence. So again, it's effective because it's an argument, and you can see the connection back to the thesis. She's exerting power over the king. So that fits into the critique of that patriarchal society. The student's got to define patriarchy. We don't have time to go into that. Patriarchy is a very generic term. It means different things at different points in time throughout history. So if you use a term like that, and I don't mean specifically having to do with the issues connected to patriarchy. I mean any term that's pejorative or generic and is used different ways in different contexts, you got to have a paragraph where you define your terms. But the way this student is using patriarchy, and I can't remember if she defines that. I think we talked about it a lot in that class, so maybe she doesn't. But any terms like that, pejorative, generic terms, you got to define. So have a paragraph or a short section where you define terms. But the way the student's using it, this clearly connects to the thesis because exerting power over him shows that. And again, don't say this paragraph is about power. State an argument. Okay, last one, and then we'll get to the poetry. Close reading. So this could be like the 3rd sentence of the student's paragraph. As each night turns to day, Scheherazade does not try to deceive the king. Instead, she offers him a choice. Tomorrow night, I shall tell you something even stranger, more wonderful, and more entertaining if the king spares me and lets me live. So that's the quote. That's your textual support. If you move on there to your next paragraph, you're making the reader assume the connection to the argument. You got to show them the connection to the argument. So this is from the student's paper. She exercises her power over the king in an overt manner that is enjoyed by the king. Unlike the more commonly seen portrayals of women covertly tricking or deceiving men and momentarily stealing their power, Scheherazade is empowered willingly by the king's encouragement to continue her stories. So here in this last sentence, she explains how the quote proves your argument from the topic sentence. And what's really cool here is you see how, like, by getting the king to go along with her plan, that's actually more powerful than other ways of exerting power. It's more subtle, but she's getting him to do what she wants. He's enjoying himself too because she's such a good storyteller. So this would be a way, I think the student goes into more detail in the sample paper, but if someone said, well, this is still patriarchal, the student could then elaborate and explain this very unique way she's exerting power over the king. So there you have three examples of examples of the three things you need: a thesis, clear topic sentences in each paragraph, and then close reading to support the ideas from the topic sentences. Final tips, again, do not think of the sample papers as templates to copy precisely. They do some things well, other things not well. They all have strengths and weaknesses. But if you don't know how to write a thesis or a topic sentence or do close reading, especially for poetry, look at these, and hopefully the example I just gave kind of helps you pinpoint those things. And then, like I said, start early and revise, have other people read it, write multiple drafts. Again, you can always email me if you want me to look at an early version of a thesis statement or an early version of a draft. I really look forward to reading your papers. It's one of my most favorite parts of the class, especially teaching online. It's one of my most favorite parts of all my classes, but especially online, since we don't get to interact in person. This is where I really get to interact with you by reading your paper and then giving you feedback back. It's like we're talking back and forth, and I get to really enjoy your ideas instead of mine, which is one of my favorite parts of the class. If you've had in-person classes with me, or if you ever do, it's a lot of discussion, not much lecture. By their nature, online classes have to be lecture-based, but my favorite part is being able to dialogue back and forth, have conversations with students. So the papers and discussion boards are a sort of way of doing that in an online medium. Okay, I'll try to keep the poetry here under half an hour and go as fast as we can, since we had all of that on writing. But I do want to give that background on sound and rhyme and romanticism, but it'll be quicker than some of the other background I've given you. And The Raven is just such a wonderful poem. I'm excited to talk about it with you. So, obviously, rhyming is in poetry. Poetry doesn't have to rhyme. It's important in poetry, but there's all different types of rhyme. So, perfect rhyme is what you think of where the words sound exactly like each other. Forced rhyme is an unnatural rhyme that forces a rhyme where it should not otherwise be. Slant rhymes are similar but lack perfect correspondence. Found in kind, grime, and game. Emily Dickinson is known for slant rhymes. She even has a poem where she says, I tell the truth, but I tell it slant, and she's referencing slant rhyme intentionally there. The romantic poets just really pair up well with sound and rhyme. A masculine rhyme has a single stressed syllable: fight and tight, stove and trove. Feminine rhyme is a stressed syllable rhyme followed by an unstressed, so like two syllables with the stressed first: carrot, garret, sever, never. Visual rhyme, the words look like they rhyme, but they don't. There's a visual element to poetry, even how it's laid out on the page, which is why I've used a lot of poems from Poetry Foundation, because they do a good job, without it being in a textbook, of keeping the original structure. I didn't want to spend too much time on poetic terminology because we have a lot, but if the class were to be expanded, not accelerated, we could do some work with the visual appearance of poetry. But even the way it's laid out on the page matters compared to, say, in a novel. Although sometimes even in novels that matters. I love literature, but it's where the words look like they rhyme. And an internal rhyme is where the rhymes are within the line of poetry, not at the end. With like perfect rhyme, traditional poetry, we think of the rhymes being at the end of the line. But The Raven, again, romantic poetry, pairs up with sound and rhyme so well, does this really clearly. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. So dreary rhymes with weary. It's within the line rather than weary rhyming with the next line. And it's such a cool, integral part of how Poe builds the tension in The Raven. It's really cool. Assonance is when the vowels rhyme in a word, like hate and sail, drive and hire. So like the I's and the A's Consonants is where the consonants rhyme. Earn and shorn, irk and torque. Um, and alliteration is where the words start with the same letter, the same sound. Lurid, luscious, lucid, libidinous. Um, Sound is so important. Again, poetry is meant to be read out loud, to be heard. So listen to these poems. I even have a question on the discussion board. It's optional. You get to pick your questions, but it's Christopher Lee reading The Raven because sound is so important, and Poe illustrates sound so vividly. So read your poems out loud. Okay, the Romantic period started in England and then was imitated by writers in the U.S. And then, of course, there was Romanticism all throughout the world, different countries. I try to include global poets, especially in lessons 5 and 6. What you get most often in classes and universities is Romanticism from England and the U.S. So on the one hand, I want to try to broaden your reading experience in this class, but on the other hand, you also just need to know these writers, especially if you're getting your degree in English, to kind of show what people will expect you to know when you finish the degree. So that's why we're looking at U.S. and English Romantic writers, but they were all over the world. But England preceded the U.S., and most of the European Romantic movements preceded the U.S. In the U.S., they call it Transcendentalism. They call it the American Renaissance. I hate that term because it's not a rebirth, and it doesn't mimic English or European Renaissance writing, but what happened in the U.S. in the mid-19th century mimics English Romanticism. So what are the qualities of it? It's a really hard period of literature to date. The Victorian period, which we'll study next time, is much easier to date. It has this theme of rebellion. So a lot of people equate it with the French Revolution, and think it ended when the first Reform Bill passed or when Queen Victoria became queen. So it's a short, intense period. So, and people who are scholars in Romanticism will debate this to the ends of the earth, and a lot of them are arguing for it to be longer. The shortest way to think of it would be 89 to 32, then 89 to 37, 85 to 32, but a lot of people call it the long Romantic period and think of it 1750 to 1850. I don't think it really matters unless you specialize in this, but I think it's helpful background for you to have as we study it. What were the themes of it? I love this phrase from a textbook I've used. Nerissa. Nature, imagination, revolution, emotion, spontaneity, and alienation. I think you can already see how all these themes are present in the poems I've assigned you for this lesson. If you think of romance, what you're reading right now probably doesn't come to mind. That's why we capitalize it. And it started with the revival of medieval romances. If you've read things like Marie de Flandre's Landval, but a lot of these terms, nature, imagination, emotion, revolution, spontaneity, can be captured under the word romanticism without talking about like dating or getting married in a literary work. So that's why we capitalize it. So there's a strong connection to spirituality. We're kind of skipping a time period here, as you saw with John Donne's work last time. The metaphysical poets were very spiritual, but then you had the Enlightenment during the later 1600s and 1700s, where everything was about logic and reason, and so we didn't study that because there wasn't much poetry then. There's some, but not a lot. And so this is kind of a reaction against that, but rather than going back to the more Christian kind of spirituality we saw in the metaphysical poets, these poets tended to find these transcendent or sublime spiritual experiences in nature. The French Revolution with the U.S. Revolution right before that really made it like an age of this like rebellious spirit. So many of the poets during this time were rebelling against traditional societal structures in their poetry. Spontaneity and impulses of feeling, right? You go out in nature, you have this transcendent spiritual experience in nature. That's a very spontaneous, unplanned thing, which connects to glorification of the ordinary, which I think is one of the cooler parts of it. They were some of the first poets to talk about the working class and other similar topics, and you really see that displayed clearly in Blake's poem, The Chimney Sweeper. Blake was from the Romantic period that we read in our first lesson. So there was a lot of supernatural and Gothic elements. This was kind of the birth of Gothic literature. And a lot of the fiction, we're studying poetry, and this period was more famous for its poetry, but a lot of the fiction written during this period were things like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Anne Radcliffe and kind of the birth of the Gothic genre. So you can see how that fits. And again, focus on the individual and alienation. With the rebellion from society, people felt very alienated from traditional societal structures, and so they rebelled against them. All right, let's take a look at the Raven. So what I'm going to do with the Raven is just look at not the first stanza, but the first stanza where the raven appears, and then the final stanza. Open here I flung the shutter when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obseisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mane of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. I love the in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. There you really hear the importance of sound I mentioned earlier with the internal rhyme, stately and saintly, but it's not a perfect rhyme either. I love that. So the story of the raven. It's what we call dramatic poetry. It's obviously clearly very dramatic, but it tells a narrative. It's an example of narrative poetry. It tells a story, but it has a lot of lyrical elements like I just read. It's obviously clearly different than the epics we studied in lesson 2, so it's sort of in between narrative and lyric poetry, which is why it's often considered dramatic poetry, but you could certainly call it lyric poetry. But the story is the speaker is grieving the death of his beloved Lenore, and while he's grieving her death, this raven appears and starts talking. Ravens are actually one of the birds like parrots who can talk. They're just not as well known for it. So this isn't necessarily supernatural. Poe was friends with Charles Dickens from England. They wrote letters back and forth, and Dickens had several pet ravens, and he wrote a book called Barnaby Rudge. It's a great book. It's not his most consistent work, but it's a fun book to read. I highly recommend it. It's one of the first ever books with a real clear depiction of a differently abled character. And that's the title character. He's surrounded by all these other characters because Dickens uses a big cast, but his pet raven Grip is almost like a helper animal, and Grip can talk a lot. But Grip was based on Dickens's own raven of the same name, who did all kinds of stuff and talked a bunch, and he wrote letters to Poe about his raven Grip. And I think it's actually stuffed in the museum in Philadelphia, and you can see it. And so Grip, Charles Dickens's raven, was the inspiration for the raven in this poem. But Poe had a hard life, many tragic deaths of close loved ones, so his life, sick himself a lot. So his life was really covered with grief, and you see him grappling with that here. So it's a poem about grief, and the raven enters into it as the speaker is dealing with his grief. And I make the argument here by looking at this stanza and then the final stanza on the next slide that we see the speaker of the poem descend into madness. And Pallas was Athena, the goddess of wisdom in Greek mythology. So by having a carrion bird, a bird that eats dead things, sitting on top of just the head, the bust of Pallas, so you're thinking the head, the brain, the goddess of wisdom, and this bird that eats dead things is perched on it. As the speaker talks with the raven, his sanity erodes because he's overwhelmed by grief. He goes from being grief-stricken to sort of going insane. And along those lines, think about talking to the raven. Like I said, ravens can say a lot of words if they learn them. As the narrative unfolds, the speaker comments and later stanzas that he thinks the raven must have, because it just flies into his room, right? It must have belonged to someone who was greatly grieved, and since ravens, like parrots or any bird that can talk, learn what to say by imitating their owners, he must have only heard the word nevermore. So the speaker's kind of making this connection to this imagined person who he believes is the raven's owner, and he continues to ask the raven if he'll see Lenore again, even though he knows from experience, because he's done it a few times, that the raven will only say nevermore. So he's kind of feeding his own grief here in this bad cycle because he's so grief-stricken his mind deteriorates. The ending of the poem, I think it's ambiguous. In fiction, we would call it open denouement. We don't have a clear-cut ending. So that's something I'd love to see you debate on the discussion boards. But here's the last stanza. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. 2 points I want to make here, and we'll quickly move on. The intricate logical structure of the poem, it's so methodically structured and the language is so beautiful and precise. That contrasts the speaker's insanity. And that's a common theme in both Poe's fiction and poetry. He's one of the few writers who achieved fame through both fiction and poetry, but often you have like The Fall of the House of Usher. Again, it has this meticulous structure that really shows Poe's sheer genius as a writer, as the characters are just going insane and they're decaying. Their bodies are decaying from their insanity. The house is decaying to mirror that. So you got kind of that irony of a very logical, structured, precise text if you look at just the writing, but then if you look at the content of the words and what they actually mean, it's showing someone going insane. Now, it sounds like it has a clear ending because it says, in my soul from out the shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So, that theme of nevermore echoes there. So it sounds like his soul will be trapped in the grief forever. But like I said, this is a poem about grieving. And when I've taught in other classes, I've used the idea of catharsis, which is a term from ancient Greece that means the purging of emotions. And Poe is referencing ancient Greece and a lot of other cultural references and allusions all throughout this poem. Allusions are a big part of it, but he's really getting at the idea here, or I'm getting at the idea, that maybe he needs to go through this experience in order to grieve. Maybe his interactions with the raven are helping him purge his emotions. So I'd encourage you to read it closely, read it multiple times. Look at those last few lines of what is exactly happening with the light that is above the raven casting his shadow on the floor. What is happening? Is the speaker trapped in his grief forever? Will he never get out of it? Is he only going to get worse? Or is the spirit experience, could it possibly give him some hope by helping him to grieve? So that's just one question, and my take on it is just one take on it. As always, I love to hear other takes on the discussion board. Okay, so I've put Emily Dickinson, William Blake, and John Keats again to give you a second U.S. poet with Dickinson. She's incredible. Love Dickinson. She's one of the greatest poets of all time. But my lessons, especially from this point forward, I'm probably going to look at 2 poems per lesson, which is all I'm doing here. We just had all that context and then the stuff on writing. just two poets going forward, and there'll be a lot of poets. So I'll just pick one and do a close reading just to give you an example of a couple close readings from kind of the topics we're covering in those lessons. And then there's lots of other stuff. You can discuss the same poems or different ones. So there's lots of other stuff for you to get into on the discussion board. But I chose Blake's poem, The Tiger, because I love Dickinson, but Blake is probably, well, Dickinson is better, but Blake just has some really interesting stuff, and the ideas in his poem, The Tiger, fascinate me. So I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about him to give you an example, close reading. And this is one of his paintings called The Great Red Dragon. He did all kinds of crazy paintings. Blake was kind of a crazy guy. If we had more time, we could go into his biography, but he clearly fits the romantics period and is kind of a companion for Poe here. Okay. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? So I love how this poem in its discussion of the tiger raises this question in the beautiful phrase, fearful symmetry. Blake often talked about the two contrary states of the human soul. He believed there was this tension, this duality within us. And so this poem, I wish I had more time to talk about it. It raises all kinds of questions about the nature of the world and the nature of humanity, good and evil. Do we all have the capacity for evil? Another kind of a companion text you could think of that's very famous would be Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the tiger is beautiful. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. Like if you've seen a tiger, maybe at a zoo or something, a tiger is beautiful. But you would not want to be around a tiger without bars between you, right? So it's beautiful, but it's deadly. And Blake talks about the two contrary states of the human soul. So this is the conundrum I love that this text poses. People are basically good is a common belief. Do we really believe that? Or if we're like this poem is often quoted by like in works of fiction as an example, or is quoted by like serial killers in works of fiction because it shows the capacity for evil in humans. And it's not one of the shows that quotes it, but there's a great British detective show called Broadchurch where the woman who lives in the town doesn't believe someone in the town could have committed murder, and the detective, who's the outsider who's been called in to help, says anyone can commit murder just given the right, if they're put in the right circumstances. So I'm not trying to say we're all murderers, but I think Blake raises an important question about human nature here that is worth exploring further. And this poem explores it. Stanza 2. In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? Again, there's so many books and things, like I said, that are named after lines in this poem. I love that line, seize the fire. But here he expands the discussion. So the first one was like the capacity for violence in the tiger. How could something be violent? But here it started talking about a creator. In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? So where was the tiger made? And if you have a creature that's beautiful but can also be destructive, what kind of God would allow that to happen? So now the poem goes from just asking what is the human capacity for good and evil to asking what is God's capacity for good and evil? And why would a God create something like this? It's kind of similar to the question people ask, why would a God allow, if a God is really as powerful as many religions ascribe God to being, why would God allow evil and suffering to exist in the world? So Blake invented his own religion that used Christ as a figure, so it would technically be considered a denomination of Christianity. Again, he was crazy, invented his own religion. But if you look into it, it was most of it, the beliefs it espouses were actually the opposites of Christianity, just had Christ as a character in it. Um, but near the end of his life, some scholars think he actually converted to traditional, or you could say true Christianity, Christianity that follows the Bible. So a lot of people like to read his text in both anti and pro-Christian ways. So like the anti-Christian reading would be that how could a God do this? How could a God create a being like the tiger? And then the pro-Christian reading would be, you make the argument that, I'll get into this more on the next slide, that, I'll get into it on the next slide. So the tiger and the lamb. Here's the last stanza. When the stars threw down their spears and watched heaven with their tears, did he smile to his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? So Blake, this is part of a collection of poems Blake published called Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And there's a matching poem in each one, like there's two versions of the Chimney Sweeper. We read the Chimney Sweeper from Songs of Innocence, but there's a second version of the Chimney Sweeper in Songs of Experience. The companion poem is the Lamb from Songs of Innocence and the Tigers in Songs of Experience. So how could the same God make the tiger and the lamb? Something beautiful and gentle, also something beautiful but massive potential for violence and destruction. And here we'll look at the last stanza and get into what I was talking about. So, tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? Again, like symmetry, right? It's kind of those half rhymes sound important to the romantic. So what you have here is the term paradox from the terminology I gave you in lesson 1. Now, there's an important difference between conflict and paradox, and this gets into the pro and anti-Christian readings of the text. And there's lots of other ways to read it. Again, I'm just giving you a couple examples. So conflict is where you have two opposing forces at war, and a paradox is where you have two opposing forces, but even though they're opposites, they're still in harmony within the text. So poets will use this as a technique, but you see it in fiction, in drama as well. And in order to do a Christian reading of it, you have to have the paradox. So like Christians will say they believe that God created all things, but is not the author of evil. So when something evil happens, God is allowing it to happen because there must be some good or greater purpose in his divine plan, but he didn't author it. And that's a paradox. So it echoes, it fits with Christianity because you have to have faith, right? So how can you believe a creator of all things didn't author evil? You have to have faith. It's a paradox. But why would he allow it? He would be powerful enough to stop it, even though he didn't author it. There must be some greater good, greater purpose to it. That's the Christian reading. Because of Blake's background, scholars take it one of these two ways. Obviously, the anti-Christian reading would be that they're in conflict. They can't be reconciled. It's not a paradox, it's a conflict. Paradox requires faith, because how could two things that are opposing forces live in harmony? Only through faith in something greater than ourselves. So that's, to me, what makes this poem so interesting. Do beautiful things have the capacity for violence? How could a God, if you believe in that explanation of how things came to be here, how could a God create something that is beautiful and violent? Why would a God even allow violence? This poem raises some of the biggest questions humanity has ever faced. And it doesn't necessarily give an answer, but there's so much you can pick apart in its 24 lines to attempt to work your way to an answer. That's what makes poetry beautiful. That's what makes literature great. So I'm just kind of scratching the surface here. Do you think these two things can be reconciled, or are they in conflict? So this is one of many, many things you can explore on the discussion board. I really look forward to reading your thoughts about romantic poetry. I hope the lesson was helpful, and I look forward to talking with you next time and reading your work.